So today we're going to move into Samuel eventually. But before I get there, I want to talk about a little book in the Old Testament that is very important. You didn't have to read it, but the book is Ruth, okay? Now, why is Ruth so popular? She's a cool lady. Okay, that's one good reason. She is one of my favorite ladies in the Old Testament. Okay, what else about, but why do we like the book? Ruth is like this, it's really, if you just look at it purely in literary terms, it is a beautiful story, right? It is a story of an outsider who's brought in. It is a story of love, ancient Near Eastern style, right? I mean, I'm not sure many of you ladies would like your future fiance to take you out in the barley fields and make you carry barley all day. But anyway, in ancient Near Eastern style, it's a beautiful love story. Okay, so we love it that way. What I want to focus on is kind of not just how beautiful the story is, but on its significance in understanding the bigger biblical story, because Ruth actually plays a really important role. And so I'm not going to take time to walk through the whole book, but would one of you like to volunteer just to give us a brief summary of Ruth? So there's one big detail about Ruth that you need to mention. Is she Israelite? No. What is she? Moabite. Okay, that's going to be play out big here in a minute. Okay, so here we go. Here's all I'm going to do. Just like I've been giving you the themes of the book, I'm just going to give you the theme of the book of Ruth, and then we're really just going to move on. If you're interested in it, it's a 4-chapter story. You can literally read it in 10 minutes, and it really is a great story. So here's the deal. This theme might shock some of you, because you're like, where'd that come from? I'm going to tell you where. Okay, so here we go. This is all you need to know about Ruth is the theme. The major theme is God's faithfulness to preserve the line of Judah by means of a virtuous Gentile woman. God's faithfulness to preserve the line of Judah by means of a virtuous Gentile woman. So here's the deal. The question is, where in the world did I get this theme? Because it sounds like a love story. How do you get this out of a love story? So let's talk about it real quick. So 2 things. First of all, let's talk about how this relates to the line of Judah. So Ruth ends in a way that really none of us would end a book in American culture, and that is it ends with a genealogy. Right? So you have this great story, and then there's a genealogy at the end. But the genealogy is important because the last word in the book of Ruth is David, the name David. Now, you guys are ahead of me in the reading, so you already know why David's important. So the book ends with David, but the genealogy actually connects David all the way back to a guy named Perez. Now, we didn't talk much about Perez, but if you remember in Genesis, there was that really weird story about Judah and Tamar. Remember, she was his daughter-in-law, and she pretended to be, shady lady, and he did, they had relations, and they had twins, Perez and Zerah. So what Ruth does, if you remember, as we've been going through the Bible, we haven't really talked about the offspring since Genesis, right? We've really been talking about God blessing the nation of Israel and God making them great, but we really haven't talked about the theme of the specific offspring. Remember that serpent crusher that we're looking for? Well, remember when we left Genesis, we knew it was coming, the kind of the theme, the line of promise was going through Judah. Well, what the book of Ruth does for us is it connects us back to Genesis to grab Perez, who was kind of the last one we knew about, and now it's connecting Perez to David, who we're about to read about. So it's a very important connector book. So it's showing how God preserved, in His sovereignty, in His plan, preserved that line of Judah, the line of Perez, through Ruth. Now, the book really focuses on Ruth, and here's 2 ways it focuses on Ruth. First, she is a Gentile, which a Gentile is a non-Jew. So any nation besides a Jew is a Gentile. So she's Gentile, but more specifically, she's a Moabite. And let me just tell you this, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, Israel is instructed not to let any Moabites into their assembly. In other words, not to bring them as part of their people because of what the Moabites did when they kind of came out of Egypt and were going into the land. So you remember how Rahab was supposed to be destroyed because she was a Canaanite. Ruth was not supposed to be a part of the people of Israel because she's a Moabite. But the story, again, is a story of redemption. So Ruth is emphasized throughout the book. She's a Moabite. She's called Ruth the Moabite several times in the book because the author wants that to kind of hit us. But what she's also described in the book is how virtuous she is. When Boaz talks to her, he says basically everyone in the town knows that you're a virtuous woman. Early in the book, when she gives her really famous speech to Naomi, your people will be my people, right? You remember this? And your God will be my God. Throughout the book, and Boaz even tells her that she came there to take refuge under Yahweh's wings, which is this idea of kind of she is putting her faith in Yahweh. So just like Rahab and Joshua, Ruth is a foreigner who is embracing Yahweh as her God, and therefore she is called a virtuous woman. And so she is the heroine of the book by far because of what she does. She takes the initiative, by the way, at the threshing floor. You know that story where she goes and lays down at his feet, and you know what I'm talking about? That's basically her saying, take me, propose. She's proposing. Okay, so she's taking the initiative and showing that she is a virtuous Gentile woman in the book. So it's this great story of redemption. And just like Rahab, guess where we find Ruth's name again? Where do we find Ruth's name? In the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. So you see here two ladies we've seen in just a span of 3 books who shouldn't have been a part of the people of God. Actually, not only God makes them a part of his people, but he makes them a part of the line of the Messiah. And so Ruth is our connector there. Okay? Now, one bonus material, and then I'll move on. So for you ladies, or for anybody really, but what's interesting about Ruth is in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth actually comes after the book of Proverbs. And you know, Proverbs 31, it gets preached every Mother's Day in churches, the story of the virtuous woman. Proverbs 31 at the end there is the virtuous woman. The phrase virtuous woman only occurs 2 times in the Hebrew Bible. Once in Proverbs 31, and then once in Ruth. So what is that? So what's interesting is in the Hebrew Bible, you read that chapter on the virtuous woman, and you're like, wow, this is a pretty impressive woman. And you're like, what does that look like in real life? And then you flip the page and you see what it looks like with Ruth. So Ruth, again, not an Israelite woman. She's a Gentile, but she becomes the model of a virtuous woman in the Old Testament. So really pretty cool stuff with the book of Ruth. I would say her faith in Yahweh and then her resulting character out of that. To use kind of James language, the New Testament book of James, her faith and her faith produced works. But it's very clear that she's not just following Naomi just for Naomi's sake. She's following Naomi also to worship Yahweh in the book. You know. So a little bit like Abraham, his faith, God accounted his faith as righteousness. I'd say the same thing about Ruth. Okay, Samuel, here comes the king. Is the subtitle of this lecture. So Samuel, here comes the king. You might notice that I'm treating 1st and 2nd Samuel together. And the reason is because in the Hebrew Bible, all the books, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, all the ones we split into 2 are considered one book in the Hebrew Bible. So for Samuel and Kings, I'll deal with them really as one book. All right. Now, you guys know that one of the universal human longings of all of our hearts is like stability, right, or security. Another longing of our heart is safety. We might even use, to kind of summarize all those, we might use the Hebrew word shalom, which is this idea of human flourishing. All of us long for that. We might disagree on how we get there, but that's kind of this universal human longing. And if you think about it, there's one thing in life that oftentimes introduces a little chaos that we don't like, and that is change or transition, right? If you think about it, there's different levels of transition in life, right? So you can probably remember when you maybe went from junior high or middle school to high school. That was probably a pretty significant transition for you. The transition from maybe like elementary school to middle school might have been a little less. So there's these normal kind of minor transitions, but they still introduce kind of discomfort and chaos in our lives a little bit, and we long for order. Then there's also kind of bigger transitions, right? If you've ever experienced the death of a close loved one, just learning to live without that loved one close to you is a major transition, right? There's just all kinds of transitions that we go through. If you've ever moved like across the country to a really different place, you've probably experienced kind of a bigger transition. But there are a few transitions that could be as big as like changing a government, right? Like if like our government changed like a flip, it would be a pretty big transition. In fact, my wife, her mother is Cuban. And so the reason I met my wife was because, this is a very bad thing, by the way, of a transition that happened in Cuba in 1959. My wife's grandfather was a high political officer. He was a pretty wealthy landowner in Cuba before Castro. But in the Communist Revolution of 1959, he became a political prisoner. So he sent his family to the States, which is my wife's mother and her aunt, to the States for safety. And he remained a political prisoner for multiple years, and then eventually he came over to Miami. So when I think about Cuba and what's happened there, the Cuban country now was not perfectly stable before communism, but it is very much a different country. It has been a different country for a number of years because of the takeover. But the point is that transition revolutionized many people's lives. And what we're going to see today in Samuel in Friday, is a pretty significant transition in how they are governed, in the type of government that runs through the book of Samuel, and how Israel is ruled. And that government is going to have some good benefits, but a lot of negative benefits that are going to affect the people for many, many years to come, just as Cuba has been affected for many, many years to come by their switch to a communist government. So here we go. Here comes the king. Like all the books we're doing, I want to talk about, first of all, the major themes of Samuel. The first major theme of Samuel is the one that I just emphasized to you, and that is the establishment of the Davidic house. The establishment of the Davidic house. Now, when I say house, I'm not using this literally. What do we mean by the Davidic house? What's another word we might use? Legacy, dynasty, right? The Davidic line. You might talk about a line of rulers, which would be a dynasty, so forth. That's what this means. So what happens in Samuel, what we're going to see, is how David's line, or David's lineage, is established before Yahweh as those who would rule over Israel. Okay? This is going to come in a very important covenant we're going to look at. So the Davidic house is really important in the book of Kings. When we think about, as an Alabama football fan, we talk a lot about dynasty. We like to, so anyway. But that's what dynasty in sports is, when a team just keeps winning championships over and over again. But this is talking about a dynasty in the sense of a lasting line where the same family is ruling over one country. All right, that's the first theme, and we're going to focus a lot of that as we go through the book. The second big theme in the book of Samuel is the God who brings low and the God who exalts. Now, this theme of God bringing low and exalting is highlighted really in two poems that serve as bookends in the book. So that at the end of the book, David has a big, long psalm that he recounts all his victories and stuff. But at the beginning of the book, we get a poem in chapter 2 from another really important lady in the Bible whose name is Hannah. And if you know the story of Hannah, she had a rival wife who could have children. She couldn't. So Hannah cries out to God for a child at the temple, or at the tabernacle, and she is given a son, and his name's Samuel, and she prays this prayer after his birth. And so, does anybody want to read for me? 1 Samuel 2, 4 through 10. So, did you guys notice that she was reading, this is Hannah's song, Hannah's prayer. Did you notice how it kept emphasizing there were certain groups that God would either bring down or judge, and there was other groups that he would exalt? And what did you notice about the types of groups? So let me read you one verse. It basically talks about how the full, those who have a lot to eat, have basically hired themselves out for bread, so they're so desperate they've made themselves slaves to get bread. But the hungry, he has done what? Made full. It talks about how the strong and the mighty, what? Will be weak. But who's going to be strong and mighty? The weak. So also the rich and the powerful will be brought down, and who's going to be exalted? The poor. And then to get really close to Hannah's situation, she talks about how the barren woman is actually going to bear 7 kids, but the woman who has 7 kids is going to be abandoned and lonely. Okay? Does that make sense what's happening here? So what is she saying here, and why is that important for us to understand? This echoes the words of Jesus on so many levels. And this is important because this is what I would call, and many others would probably call, God's upside down kingdom. And so here's what I mean by this. God's kingdom actually reverses the priorities of earthly kingdoms. Does that make sense? So just think about our world. The people who are looked up to are the rich, the powerful, the famous, right? Those who are well-to-do. Those are the people who are put on pedestals. Those are the people who are lifted up. The people who are talented, right? And then in our world, who are put down? The people who, the social outcasts, right? The poor. Again, it's the same agenda that's run through all earthly kingdoms, right? And so here's what is interesting. God is saying, what Hannah is saying is she's revealing to us something about God. He is the God whose heart is inclined towards those who are rejected by the world. And He opposes those who are exalted in the world. Does this make sense? So this is what we'd say God's upside-down kingdom. His priorities are different than ours. If you think about the Beatitudes, blessed are the what? Poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who are poor. Right? These are the paradigm, the pattern of God's kingdom is that His heart is inclined towards the humble. That's why several times in the Bible it says God opposes what type of people? The proud, but gives grace to the humble. Jesus said it this way, another way. Jesus said, if you want to be first, you must be last. And if you want to be last, you will be first. In other words, in general, this is not always true. It's not like every, but in general, what's going to happen is when God's kingdom returns, when Christ returns, He's going to take the world system and flip it upside down. Okay? So what does this mean for us now as Christians? What this means for us as Christians now is that we have to be driven by the kingdom's priorities and not by the world's priorities. This is why Jesus tells us that if we want to follow Him, we need to be servants of others. This is the radical call of Christianity. Christianity isn't an arrogant, boastful calling. Christianity is a servant-centered, humble calling in which we are persecuted and we do experience attacks, but we remain humble and keep serving and loving others. That's the call of the kingdom of God, and it takes great faith to do that because everything around us is pushing us into this mold that says, I want to live a me-first mentality and not serve others. And if I don't talk about my survival, nobody else is going to look out for me, right? And that's what we're entrenched in. But what Samuel teaches and what we're going to see over and over again through the Bible is God is favorable towards those who are lowly, just like Hannah was, okay? Just to give you an example of this, I actually like the beat of this song, but there's a song called, it's the chorus of High Hopes by Panic at the Disco. Anybody heard this? Okay, it goes, it says, I had to have high hopes for a living, shooting for the stars when I couldn't make a killing. Didn't have a dime, but I always had a vision, always had high hopes. I had to have high hopes for a living. I didn't know how, but I always had a feeling I was going to be that one in a million. I always had high hopes. So I say this song not to be critiquing the song, but I'm just telling you about our culture. We're taught from this age, right, that we need to shoot for the stars, that we need to shoot to be that one in a million. But Christianity, the gospel calls us not to be shooting for our own fame and not shooting to be that one in a million, but to shoot for servanthood to others so that we can make them the one in a million. That's the radical difference that Christianity, that God's upside-down kingdom brings. And we get a taste of that even here in Hannah's poem. She gets it, and she understands it. All right? Any question on that? So we talk about upward mobility. In God's kingdom, it's downward mobility, right? The lower you go, the higher you will be in God's kingdom on that one. All right. You ready to jump in the book? So there's so much we could talk about. There's some really fun stories at the beginning of the book that involve the Philistines and the ark and all this stuff with Eli and his wicked sons in the temple. But what I want to focus on first is I just want to move to kind of the big transition that we just talked about that's going to happen. And that is when Israel demands a king. Israel demands a king. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, Samuel was the last judge. You guys remember this from your reading? He's the last judge, but Samuel also serves as a prophet and a priest. So he's like what we would call an all-around athlete. He can do it all, okay? Now, what's interesting about Samuel, though, is the irony of it is he was a really good judge. He's probably like the model judge and prophet in the historical books. But what's interesting is what triggers Israel to ask for a king is it says that when he was old, his sons actually started judging Israel, and they were wicked. I don't know how many times in the Bible, you guys might notice this, you'll have a righteous king or a righteous prophet or a righteous somebody, and then their sons just be despicable. It happens all the time. Well, Samuel's a good example. So his sons are bad judges. So the people then, it prompts them to start demanding a king. Now, and from your reading, does anybody remember why they wanted a king? Now, obviously, Saul's son, but what was their ultimate motive? Does anybody remember from your reading? It should have jumped off.
They wanted to make the nation.
Yeah. The key phrase and the most, like this is the irony here is so thick and so rich. They wanted to be like the nations. Okay? The Israelites wanted it to be like the nations. And then the question becomes, in what way did they want to be like the nations? Anybody know from your reading?
They wanted a king.
Okay, okay, good. No, they wanted a king to be like nations, but in what specific way? More specific than just a king. They wanted their king to do what?
Rule over them.
Okay, they didn't want him to rule, but what was, here, I'll help you. What was the primary role of a king in the ancient world?
Mediator between them and God.
Okay, that was one. Yes, that's a big one. But also kings were warriors. Okay? So they wanted a king to, in 1 Samuel 8:20, I'll read it to you. Here's what it says. It says, that we also may be like all the nations, and our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, what is the great irony of them wanting a king to fight their battles? Up to this point, who's been fighting their battles? God. Yeah, Yahweh has. Yahweh has been fighting their battles. You remember? That was the theme of Joshua. Yahweh fought for Israel. So here's the deal. At this point in the story, what we're getting is a transition from a theocracy. Everybody heard that word before? A theocracy is basically direct rule by God over Israel to a monarchy. That's what's happening in this story. Now, is Samuel happy? No. Okay, good. If you read your text, you know Samuel was not happy at all. In fact, Samuel goes to Yahweh, and Yahweh, basically Samuel comes back to the people, and he gives them like a laundry list of all the bad things the king is going to do to them. He basically tells them the king's going to take your sons and put them in military battle. He's going to take your wives and your daughters, and make them maidservants. He's going to tax you. He's going to do all these things to you. And the people say, what? We still want a king.
Nice.
Yeah, they say nice. Yeah, that's good. Nice. Take all my stuff. That's what I want to see. Yeah. So anyway, they want to be like the nations. And what Yahweh tells Samuel is really important. He tells Samuel, hey, Samuel, don't take this personally. They're not rejecting you, but they are rejecting me, talking about Yahweh. So it is a rejection of Yahweh as their king. So they have, in demanding a king, they have rejected Yahweh as their king, and they want an earthly king, so therefore that's the theocracy to the monarchy that we're talking about. Now, so God oftentimes, I said this in the book of Judges, I'll say it again, oftentimes gives people exactly what they want in order to teach them valuable lessons. So God gives them a king, and their first king is, you guys know this easy? Saul. Okay, Saul. Now, if we look at our Bibles in 1 Samuel 9, we get a description of Saul. Okay? Now, what's interesting, I'll read it real quick. In 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2, it says, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. And here we go. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Now here's my question. Before we even get to his physical description, there's something in verse 1 that should cause some flags to go off in our head that this might not be a good idea. What was that? What tribe was he from? Benjamin. What tribe was the king supposed to come from? Judah. And what just happened in Judges with the Benjaminites?
They just messed up.
The Levite's concubine. Yeah. So there's red flags everywhere if you know the biblical story. But the second thing is we do get an extensive focus on his physical description. So Saul's chosen as king, and it's focused on his physical description. Now, you guys have been reading the Bible for half a semester, well, a little under. we've been reading through the biblical story. Are physical descriptions of characters common in the biblical story? Can you tell me what Moses looked like? Oh, there you go. Great job. That's it. Good. When he was young, you don't know if he had white color hair, eyes, anything, right? Can you tell me what Abraham looked like? Okay, here's the point. The Bible usually doesn't focus on a physical description of its characters. It actually focuses on a moral description of its characters. So whenever the biblical text starts describing someone's physical features, your ears should kind of pluck up, okay? Because it usually is important. For instance, I'll give you a story. Remember the story of Jacob and he had Leah and Rachel? You remember this? And it said Leah's eyes were weak. I don't know what that means, but something wasn't right with her eyes. Why is that important information in the story? What did Leah desire more than anything? To be loved by Jacob. But Jacob loved who more than Leah? Rachel. How's Rachel described? Beautiful. Very beautiful. Yeah. So in other words, the physical description gives us contrast that helps us understand the story and the motives of Jacob. Now, why would Saul be described in the way that he's described? I mean, he is that way, so it's historical, but why does the author include this? So remember, they asked for a king like all the nations who would fight before them. So if you were to have a draft pick for a king, right? So if you have a draft pick and you get to pick your own king, guess who's your number one pick? Saul, because he is a perfect protege. He's handsome, and he's head and shoulders above the others, which implies that he has physical strength and he's also from a wealthy family. So he's got all that you want in a king. He's your number one pick, okay? However, what we're going to see a little later, a few chapters later, is that God is not necessarily worried about the physical description of his king. What is God focused on more than that? Spirit. So this does serve as a contrast to another king we're about to talk about, King David. Because when Samuel goes to Jesse's house to anoint the next king after Saul, Jesse brings his firstborn and he keeps going and he looks at all his sons. He says, nope, there's no king here. He said, do you have another king? And he said, yeah, another son. He said, yeah, he's out in the fields. And David is described as what? A what now? Not a weakling. He's described as a young man, a young boy, a shepherd boy. But in that text it says, God does not look on the outward appearance as man does. God looks at the heart. So this is what so Saul, y'all have heard of foil characters before in like movies? Saul in one sense serves as a foil character. He highlights David's integrity by showing us what a good king doesn't do. Okay, that's the story of Saul. All right? Now, hold on, I got 2 minutes and then we're going to... So the last thing is quickly after he is chosen, Saul is rejected by Yahweh. Do you guys remember in the story... when you read it, Saul actually has two major actions in which he disobeys Yahweh. One is he's in battle with the Philistines, and Samuel, the priest, is coming, but he doesn't wait on him. And so what does he do? What does Saul do? He makes an unlawful sacrifice as the king. The king wasn't supposed to make a sacrifice. So Samuel rebukes him there and basically implies that God's done with him. But then a little later, he also fails to wipe out he keeps the best of the spoil of the Amalekites after God told them to devote the Amalekites to the ban. And so Samuel again comes and rebukes him and basically there makes it clear that God was rejecting him as king and that God was going to raise up another one in his place. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about the other one that we all know is King David, right, who comes. And so we get that contrast throughout the story.